Good morning. This year, Alex and I are encouraging us at North Heights to face the book. It is a mini series of sermons that we're kind of peppering throughout the year as we allow the Bible to give us some harsh truth and sometimes some tough love. The phrase face the music, well, this is face the book. We sometimes need to be told the grim reality of the situation, whatever it may be. And we are building our sermons around one key word, and that is the word faith. But what kind of faith? There's a lot of adjectives you can apply to and add to the word faith. Earlier this year, Alex talked to us about great faith. Later this year, Alex will talk to us about confident faith. And then at the end of the year, I will speak to us again on the subject of desperate faith. So there's a lot, as you can see, of different kinds of faith. You put a different adjective on it, and it really changes the entire tenor of the idea and of the study. This morning, I think is very fitting, as we are still in the midst of this pandemic, and we're still in the midst of our quarantine, which really is where so much of our negative emotions come from. There's a lot of bitterness, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of worry. There's so much emotion being stirred up as a result of this quarantine. And everyone has opinions about it one way or the other, but that's not my point. My point is looking at this from a spiritual perspective and seeing how it's very easy for the devil to take advantage of the situation and to stir within us a shrinking of faith. And so I want to talk about that this morning as we face the book and let the Bible tell us about little faith. And of the four that we're looking at, this really is the only one of the four that we need to avoid. We should have great faith. We should have a confident faith. And there is nothing wrong with having a desperate faith, because that implies a reliance on God. But there is something to be said in a negative way about having little faith. And you never hear that phrase used in a positive context. The closest you'll get to it in a good sense is Jesus' parable of the mustard seed. But even in that sense, he's saying, even if your faith could only be so little, it could still accomplish great things. In this case, when you say little faith, you're talking about someone who is failing to live up to their potential. Now, if a mustard seed is as much potential as I could have, that's as much as I can. But if I could potentially have great faith and instead choose to have little faith, that's a problem. Maybe the most famous time when this phrase was used is in Mark chapter 4. When Jesus and the disciples together are in a boat and a great storm comes. And the disciples react negatively to the storm, and Jesus rebukes the winds and the waves, and then turns to rebuke his disciples by saying, by mentioning their little faith. Let's read the text. Mark chapter 4, verses 36 through 41. When they had sent away the multitude, they took him even as he was in the ship, and there was also with him other little ships. And there arose a great storm of wind, and the waves beat into the ship so that it was now full. That is to say, water was filling into the boat. And he was in the hind, he being Jesus, in the hind part of the ship, asleep on a pillow. And they, the apostles, awoke him and said to him, Master, do you not care that we perish? And he arose, Jesus did, and rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was great calm. And he said to them, Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? And they feared exceedingly, and said one to another, What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Of course, such a response is expected when you see a great miracle like that, to be in awe and to be wondrous of it. And here at the beginning of the ministry, it's likely the disciples have not seen everything Jesus could do. In fact, they'll never see everything Jesus could do. But this is the first time he does something that seems to just stop and reverse the ferocity of Mother Nature as we describe weather. And so it elicits a great response from them, a tremendous response, I mean to say. Shocked that this person could do such amazing things. But it's the phrase that Jesus utters just before that. In Mark's account, and there are different accounts of this, in Mark's account he says, How is it that you have no faith? In Matthew's account it is, O ye of little faith, which is the title of the sermon, what it's derived from. There are a lot of people who walk around, and here's our application, like pessimists. There are a lot of people who walk around assuming that things will go wrong, who are just waiting for something to happen, expecting something to happen. And invariably, subconsciously, they cause those things to happen just for a self-fulfilling prophecy. They are expecting bad to happen, and so they tend to encourage it subconsciously so that when it does, they feel the satisfaction of being correct. And that gives them some sense of control over a world that they feel like is spinning out of control. And so they're pessimistic, and they're doom and gloom, and they're very negative. There are other people who are very cynical and who, without necessarily acting in a negative way, are just always negative in their mindset and negative in their words. And usually you see this as the third party. People are discussing, and this is just the guy in the background or the person in the background saying, that's not going to work. That's not going to happen. You're not going to do it. It's just this constant just regurgitation of negativity that is within their heart. Now, I'm not saying that it is necessarily the right course of action to be just blind optimists and to say every single day everything's going to go great. That I'm not going to have any problems today, because that's not reality, and that's not even what Christianity is all about. Christianity is not about saying pie in the sky, head in the clouds, or head in the sand. Everything is always going to be great, because everything is not always going to be great. If it was, I'd be preaching to an auditorium of 400 people right now. Instead, you're all in your homes because there's a virus going around that is killing some people and panicking everyone else. So everything is not always going to be great. The problem with the problem with criticism and with cynicism is taking the fact that things could be bad and saying they will always be bad. The problem with pessimism is the presumption before it even happens that whatever will happen will be bad. That's not right. So we don't need to be pessimists, but we don't need to be these difficult to deal with, peppy, constantly optimistic people either. There has to be a reality middle ground. So let's be peptimists. Let's be peptimists. Let's be people who are peppy, but also realistic. Let's be people who say, I want things to go well. Maybe things will go well, but if things don't go well, I will trust in God. Because the person who says everything's always going to go great, when something invariably doesn't go right, that person tends to panic the worst and give up the quickest. So what we need to learn, what I want us to learn from this text, is that our faith should be great. But if we are cynical or we are blindly optimistic, we are asking ourselves, we are setting ourselves up to have the devil come and knock our legs out from under us and shrink our faith down to being little. There are some great lessons of application we can learn from this text. And I have 4 I want to share with you as we talk about and make application to how we should respond to a crisis. What should we do when our faith is being challenged and we have the potential to grow or to shrink in our faith? If you go back to the text that we read from Mark chapter 4 or Matthew 8 or whatever text you want to choose, when the storm came and the disciples first looked at it, notice, by the way, Jesus was in the back of the boat asleep. He wasn't worried about it, but the disciples were awake. They can't help that. They observe the storm and they react to it. That's perfectly human and natural. But they don't just say, wow, that's a really big storm. It's coming this way. Well, I suppose we should wake up the master and see if we need to do something. There was no sense of calmness to them. There was an immediate sense of panic. Their first reaction was to assume the worst. Their first reaction was to say, Master, Master, we perish. We are going to die. So the first thing they do is they panic. Number 1 point, if something happens, when the storms of life arise, do not panic. The disciples' first action was to freak out. That should never be your first action. When a person goes through a period of panic mentally, their brain shuts down. When fear grips hold of us, we don't think straight, we don't think rationally, we don't even see things clearly. Our ability to perceive things is distorted. And so something could cross through your path and you'd be right in front of your face. You might even react to it. And then after everything settles and subsides and your fear is gone, you have no memory of seeing that thing cross in front of your face. Fear is a powerful controller of our senses. And so the first thing that a person should do when they're going through a panic is settle down. Don't panic. The disciples, let's learn from what they did by knowing what not to do. They scream and they cry to Jesus, Master, Master, we're going to die. That's Matthew's account. In Mark's account, they wake him up and they say, Master, do you not care that we perish? Which we'll get to that in just a minute. But lesson number 1, when the storms of life rise, do not panic. It is, in fact, going to be okay. I'm reminded, and I taught this on Wednesday night, I'm reminded of what Jesus says in John chapter 14. Right after he told the disciples he's going to die, their reaction is not necessarily to panic, but it is to be very sad. Their expressions drop. Their faces droop. They are very emotional. And so Jesus says to them right after I'm going to die, let not your heart be troubled. And I love that word troubled in the original language because it literally means agitated. It means disturbed, not at rest. You take a pot of boiling water or just a pot of water and put it on your stove and it's still and calm. And then you crank up the heat. And at first, it's still and calm. Everything's fine. But as the heat rises and it starts to heat the water, you'll start to notice the water change. And there's a period where just before it boils and it starts to just bubble up and go crazy, there's a period where the water, it all just kind of goes shoop, and it almost looks like it's sucking in on itself and then it just starts bubbling like crazy. That sense of agitation as the water's about to boil over, that's what the word means. And that's what Jesus perceived when he looked into the heart of his disciples. After he says, I'm going to go away and die, he could see their hearts starting to churn and their stomachs start to get upset and their minds start to race. They weren't panicking necessarily, but they were getting very upset. And Jesus has to say, let not your heart be troubled. It's going to be okay. Everyone take a breath. Everyone calm down. And for 3 chapters, John 14, 15, 16, let me explain to you why and how it's going to be okay. Here we're on a boat, and the disciples panic. They turn around in order to wake up Jesus, but that should have been a red flag for their panicking. They should have immediately said to themselves, wait a minute, whoa, Jesus is asleep. Jesus is calm. Jesus is cool. Maybe we should follow our master's lead. But they don't. They panic, they scream, and they wake him up. Lesson 1. When trouble arises, don't panic. Be calm. Think clearly. Lesson 2. Don't get discouraged. Don't get discouraged. Again, go back to the text. What did the disciples say to the Lord when they woke him up? They did not go to Jesus and say, Master, wake up. Hey. They didn't do that. They didn't nudge him. They nudge him? No, they didn't do that. They rushed to Jesus and probably 24 hands start shoving his body, saying, Master, Master, we need your help. Now, how easy would it have been to say, hey, Jesus, you got, I mean, it's a big one. What should we do? And then they wouldn't have even gotten rebuked for that. Because God does not rebuke you for turning to him for help. The problem with the disciples was not that they asked God for help. It was that they asked him not even for help. They didn't even say help. They just said, we're going to die. So the problem was not that they didn't ask for help or that they asked God for help at all. It was that they had this presumption that it was already over with. They were already giving up. They were discouraged. Now listen, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. When crazy things happen, when bad things happen, the storms of life, as we say, happen, I am not usually the first one to panic. In fact, I can be frustratingly calm when a crisis happens because my wife is usually the one to panic. I get discouraged. And that's so much more of an internal response. And I'm a very internal kind of person, so that makes sense to me. I tend to get discouraged. And so it's my fault that our family motto is Martin's, there's always a problem, which is such a negative phrase. And I feel so bad. And I repent every time I think of it. But it's just our family has this history of we have a great idea, we execute the idea, everything seems to be great about the idea, and then there's just one thing. There's always a fly in the ointment. There's always one thing that seems to either unravel the whole thing or cause a lot of headache and heartache. There's always a problem. And that just became this running gag that me and Lauren had that we've carried over 3 children later and several houses later. There's always a problem. But that comes from a heart that's easily discouraged. And I can see that about myself, the inclination toward pessimism and the presumption that there's going to be a problem. And that's not healthy, I recognize. So I need to learn from this text, and maybe you do as well, that when trouble arises, don't get discouraged. Listen to the word, discourage. Well, what should be the opposite word of discourage? Encourage. Now, what God wants of you is to be encouraged. He wants you to have courage. He wants you to have confidence. He wants you to have faith. He wants you to have a strong, resolute standing that it's going to be okay. A discouraged person will never say it's going to be okay. A discouraged person is on the negative side of that spectrum. They're worried about all the ways it's not going to be okay tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And at most you might get out of them, they might say, well, we have to crawl, we have to dig our way out of this problem. And so they're focusing on the digging and the crawling and the difficulty. Whereas an encouraged person is immediately going to say, okay, the reality is this, we can overcome, let's get to work. And they start encouraging other people. Listen, both of these emotions are very catching. What's the word I'm looking for? They're very addictive. They're very, what's that word? Contagious. They're very contagious. You know, you have an encouraging attitude, and other people who have good hearts will feel encouraged too. If you have a discouraging attitude, you will very likely bring down the people around you. Even the people who are optimistic and encouraging will grow frustrated, and you'll discourage them in that way over your negative attitude. So let's respond to the problem, whatever it may be, with encouragement. My old preacher mentor, Carol Seitz, years and years and years, 25 years or so, he was at Higdon, maybe even longer than that. He used to always say, don't encourage the devil by being discouraged. The only person who's getting any satisfaction out of you being discouraged is Satan himself. Don't encourage the devil by getting discouraged. I'm reminded of Deuteronomy, or no, I'm not. I'm reminded of Numbers, chapter 14, when the spies, I should say, went out into the land, and they scouted the land for the eventual conquest. And they came back and they reported that the land was filled with giants. 12 spies were sent. 10 of them had the same report. It's filled with giants, with great armies and walled cities and fortresses. And we don't stand a chance, this army of ours. We don't stand a chance to conquer them. 2 spies tried to be encouraging. 2 spies tried to have courage and say, God got us here. God will get us there. We can do this. We can. 10 spies were discouraging. And they drowned out the courage of the 2, Caleb and Joshua, and they convinced all the people to say, woe is me, it can't be done. And their discouragement caused God to drive them away from the promised land. They wandered for 40 years until that discouraged, cowardly generation died. And the encouraged, faithful generation who came after went in and took the land, no problems at all. Don't be discouraged. Listen to Matthew 5, 11 and 12. Blessed are you when men shall do everything to discourage you, such as revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Instead of being discouraged, Jesus says, rejoice and be exceeding glad. How can I do that, Jesus? Because have some perspective. Great is your reward in heaven. It's tough right now. It's not pie in the sky, but that's not cynicism either. It's the reality of the situation. It's tough right now, but your reward will be great. So don't be discouraged. So, we're in a storm. We're in trouble. We looked at the disciples. What did they do? When things went bad for them, they panicked. They got discouraged. They freaked out. They ran to Jesus. Third thing, you don't want to do this when a storm arises. Don't blame God. Oh, how many times do people say something like this? How could God let this happen? Where's God now? Oh, everything was great, and now God has abandoned me. You know, it seems to me that most of the people who blame God when things get bad tend to forget about God when things are good. I have rarely, if ever, met a person who is always praising God on good days and then blaming God on bad days. I just don't find those people. I tend to find the people who forget what God's first name is when things are good. And it's always, I got this promotion at work because I'm such a great worker, and I got the cushy parking spot because I'm such a great employee, and then they get fired. They lose their job, and suddenly it's, oh God, why did you do this to me? Well, I don't know. I tend not to think that God cares where you work, but maybe God is responsible. I'll concede the possibility. But it's not because God is just a vengeful, mean God. Maybe it's because you weren't thinking about him when things were good, so he thought, well, maybe if I take it away, he'll think about me. Because that's what God cares about. And it's only our selfishness that thinks of that as a bad thing. It's only out of our selfishness and our love for a comfortable world that we say, well, it's mean of God to take away my job, or to take away my dog, or to break down my car, whatever bad thing it may be. It's mean for God to do those things and cause my life to have some badness and some difficulty. But wait, if the goal is for you to reconnect with God and to lean on him more and rely on him more, then how is that a bad thing? It seems to me like God is simply teaching you a lesson, and lessons sometimes hurt. That's why it's called discipleship, discipline. You're disciplined. You're learning to be a better disciple by being corrected. So you can blame God, but all you're doing there is you're just angering the teacher. Appreciate the lesson and learn from it, and then so much better may come. People have to get it out of their heads that God is to blame in general for their bad decisions. Yes, based on what I just said, yes, it could be the case that God does something to teach a lesson, but very often things just happen. I have this saying, I have the other saying, there's always a problem. Okay, I have this other saying that I love a lot more. Sometimes your dog just dies. Sometimes your dog just dies. And there isn't always a grand explanation. There isn't always some big picture concept. You're not always being taught some great lesson. You might learn a lesson from it. It'd be great if you could find a positive lesson out of it. But there isn't always a grand scheme of things that involved Fido biting the dust. Sometimes your dog just dies. Why did God let my dog die? Well, why did your dog die? Well, because I ran over it with my car. Well, then why aren't you blaming yourself? You blamed God for you running over your dog with your car, and that caused your car to break down, which caused you to be late for work, which caused you to be fired. And you're blaming God for you getting fired when it's your fault for not watching out for your dog. Why are you blaming God? People are so quick to blame God. Do you know why? This is not revolutionary. This is not insightful. This is just common sense. You know why people blame God for their problems? Because it's easy. Because it is convenient. Because they can say all day long, it's your fault, God, and God will never bring a heavenly finger down and say, because God is not so petty and so insecure to lower himself to argue with a person like that. They take God's silence as an admission of guilt. And they will blame God all day long, and because they'll never hear anything to the contrary, they'll believe they're right, that God really has turned against him. And it's remarkable how many people are willing to row that boat. I had someone tell me one time, back when I was at Higdon, someone told me, it's the most cliched, stupid thing. Oh, me and God, we have an understanding. I don't talk to him, he doesn't talk to me. I promise you, God has never given that understanding to anybody. That contract has never been signed by the Almighty hand. He has never said, I won't talk to you and you won't talk to me and we'll just go our separate ways. That is not Jehovah God. What happened was that person was talking to God and God didn't answer back the way that person wanted. And then when bad things happen, as bad things do because the devil is always active, or God is always teaching and they're not always listening, when those bad things happen because God wasn't talking the way he wanted him to talk, he assumed God wasn't listening. So he said to God, I won't talk to you anymore if you won't talk to me. And because God doesn't answer back to those kind of things, because God's not your master, because you're not God's master, then that person believed that God had forgotten about him, that God had rejected him. And that's not the way it was. When bad things happen, it does you no good blaming God. Think about how crazy that is. God is not the cause of your problems. God is your only hope to solving your problems. He is the solution to your problems. If you blame God, if you make God the enemy, then all you have done is turned your back on the one and only being who might be able to help you. Who are you going to turn to now? You You're the one with the problems. You're going to turn to me? I got my own. You're going to turn to the devil? He's probably causing them. Who are you going to turn to solve your problems? God is your solution, and you're angry with him. Don't blame God for your troubles. When the storms of life come, don't panic. When the storms of life arise, don't get discouraged. When trouble comes, don't blame God. Cast your care on God, and he will care for you. Finally, before we close, when the storms of life come, don't quit. Don't give up. Don't throw your hands in the air and say, it's over for me. Just bring on sweet death. When bad things happen, a lot of people, their first reaction is to panic. It's just the initial surge of adrenaline, rush, fight or flight, and they flee and they panic, but then the shock wears off. And then they get down and they get discouraged, because after the shock wears off and they've no longer panicking and the trouble is still there, it's just lingering there because it hasn't been dealt with, then they get discouraged. They see this big mountain in front of them and they don't know how to climb it, and they get down in the dumps. And so they blame God. God, you put this mountain here. God, why did you give me this hardship? And they're just projecting blame because they don't know how to deal with the problem. They don't know how to solve it. They may not even want to solve it. They want to wallow in misery, and so they just start blaming other people, including God. And when that happens, all that's left for them to do is to quit. I mean, of course, that's it. What else is there? Once you blame God, once you've taken away from the equation the problem solver, you have no help. You have no hope. And a person with no hope quits. Why wouldn't you quit? So correct the other three, and the fourth one will be corrected by itself. If you don't panic, you won't get discouraged and you won't blame God, and so you won't want to quit. But what do we say to those people who are in that boat right now, metaphorically speaking, who are in the position of saying, oh, I'm just going to give up. I can't do it. I'm going to quit. Listen, people need to be reminded that God is not their enemy. They need to be reminded that God is their friend, that God is on their side, that in that boat with the disciples, while they were panicking, while they were discouraged, while they were shaking Jesus saying that we're going to die and you don't care, Jesus woke up and calmed the storm. God is the solution to your problems. Now, I say that and I need to qualify. God doesn't always calm the storm. But He will, if not that, He will calm you. And let the storm rage, and if you're calm, it doesn't matter. You hunker down in the tornado shelter and the storm blows over. And it may take your house, but not your life. And you're going to be okay. And that sometimes happens too. We need to be reminded that God will calm something. Either the storm, or just you, or both. Have you ever watched a football game where, or really any kind of game, but football in particular, where the losing team is down by so many touchdowns and there's only so many seconds left and they have the ball and they just start running the ball? And that's when you know, okay, they've conceded, it's over, they're just running out the clock, the game's over. They just hand the ball off, get 2 yards and punt. Just get the game over with as soon as possible. That they've quit. They have given up. No one ever does that. No one ever gives up when they're winning. Now I know, again, I must say in football, the winning team does also try to run out the clock, but that's more mercy. A lot of teams will just continue playing the game. But the point of the illustration is, you don't quit. You don't give up. You don't forfeit when you're winning. Running the ball when you're losing is just a concession of forfeit. You're just saying, I quit. I give up. I will allow you to win. Running the ball when you're winning is just getting the victory over with more quickly. But when you're losing and you give up, that's the end. There's no turning back. Once you go down that path, that's it. Nobody ever quits when they're winning. And you look at this text in Mark and in Matthew, we are going to die, they say. Do you not care that we are going to die? They have given up. They have conceded, it's over. They don't say, Master, please stop the storm because we're going to die. That'd be its own kind of problem. They just say, we're going to die, and you don't care. But Jesus doesn't listen. He gets up, He rebukes the wind, He rebukes the wave, and then He rebukes the disciple. He rebukes the wind and the wave to calm them, and He rebukes the disciples to calm them. And He says to them, why were you afraid? where was your faith? You had so much faith when you're on dry ground. And now when a storm on the sea comes, your faith grows smaller and smaller. Why are you so fearful? Oh, you of little faith. A question that sadly we've all had to be asked of ourselves too often. We go through a difficult time. We go through a hardship and we panic. And when the panic wears off, we get discouraged. And we look to project blame and to cast blame, and we blame it on the biggest entity we can find. We blame God. And then we give up. We sit down in the mud and we say, just bring the sweet end, the sweet merciful end to this misery. And we've missed the fact that we rejected the one person, the one being, who could bring our problems either away or bring us through them. Don't quit. Listen, like I just said a minute ago, no one who's winning the game ever quits. If you're a Christian, you're winning the game. Now, it may be difficult right now, but have perspective. Rejoice because great is your reward. You have won. You won when Jesus rose, and you rose with him from the watery grave. So being a winner, you don't need to panic. Short little difficulty doesn't compare to the glory that awaits. Being a winner, you don't need to get discouraged. Have courage in your champion, Jesus, who brought you victory. Being a winner, you don't need to blame God. You should thank God that ultimate victory is yours. Being a winner, you don't need to quit. Why would you quit? You've already won. So I know difficult times are here, and you know what? I don't know the future. Difficult times may be here for a while longer. But we're not going to panic. We're not going to get discouraged. We're not going to blame God. We're not going to quit. We're going to persevere. We're going to endure. And we're going to be better for it on the other side. And if death comes before that happens, well, we're going to be even better for it as well. Let's have a prayer before we close. Our Father, we're thankful for the study that we've had this morning, for the opportunity to read about the disciples and their mistakes so that we might learn from them and correct them. We're thankful for the lessons of Jesus and how he taught us not to have little faith but great faith, to have full confidence in you to get us through the storms of life, whether that means stopping the storms or just stopping our worries. Help us, Father, as we go through this pandemic here, as we go through the difficulties that have resulted from it, to have perspective, to have positivity, to be realistic, but also to ever be faithful, that you will get us through it one way or the other. It's in Jesus that we pray. Amen. God bless you. We'll see you next week.